Hello, and welcome to this episode. Today, Christen and I are going to be discussing Hecate's three forms. There's many epithets associated with Hecate's triple nature that come to us from antiquity. Triformis, Trivia, Trioditis. There are others as well, all starting with that TRI that signifies three. So now that we've cleared up the historical epithets, let's get into why three forms. And Christen and I talk all about that in this episode. Hail Hekate, she of three forms. Hello, Christen and I are triply excited to be discussing Hekate Triformis. Triformis means triple formed. She of the three forms. It's perhaps one of the most intuitive ways we connect to Hekate. We may perceive her as triple formed, and many of us will have statues. You can see mine behind me that are triple formed and so on. We're diving into what this means, some of the a bit of the history, of course, some of the meaning, and different ways we can connect and understand Hecate's three formed selves. Well, Christen, I feel like we should have three candles, but we have one, well, two. So this is, if you're watching this, you can see my candle has a sigil on it. So this is the Triformis sigil that you'll find in Covina, and you'll also find it in Entering Hecate's Cave. And of course, there is a chapter entitled Triformis in that book. So if you're interested in understanding more about how Triformis works on us, that chapter is an excellent place to get started. We are going to do our threefold ritual, though. At least we have a Triformis ritual to begin. So connecting us with Hecate's threefold nature and, of course, her sacred flame. So let's just begin with that counterclockwise motion, letting go of anything that is kind of blocking us. One of the great things about Hekate Triformis is that she is about transformation. So just releasing any energy that's impeding your ability to transform into what you are becoming, because like Hekate, we are always transforming. And now clockwise circle, protecting us, connecting us. We can see that triple Hekate forming a shield around us as we go into this discussion. Christen.
Yes.
To me, this is so interesting, this Hekate being three formed. I want to say, like, dating back in the over 2 decades since I've been building this relationship of mine with Hekate, that like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the triple formed Hekate was much less common than it is today. Like if you do a scan, say, of Pinterest, or you go on Etsy and see what people are selling, there is like an abundance of triple Hecates for sale.
Yeah.
And I'm always so curious about, like, well, why is this? Like, why does this resonate so much with us? And then I thought, well, you should see how much it resonates with you. So what I did, Christen, is I went and looked in my books and I counted. I did a word, like a find to see how many times I either used Triformis, triple goddess, or three in a ritual, a spell, a reading, something. So in Entering Hecate's Garden, it was 111, which I love because I love prime numbers. And then in entering Hecate's cave, I think it was 136, which numerologically is 10 or 1. Anyway, I won't get into numerology. But this being said, in all of my personal practice and my teaching and writing, like the 3 is so central. Like the ritual we just did, 3 parts. The meditation we do, 3 parts. 3 cells. 3, like this is, and I was kind of like taken by surprise because I knew I was paying homage to Hecate's triple nature in a lot of things that I did and taught, but I had no idea to what extent. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, that makes total sense.
And then I was thinking about you and the triangle business.
Yeah, I have a very special relationship with triangles. And I guess in the beginning for me, I always saw Hecate as like, this torchbearer. And it wasn't until I started contemplating the crossroads that the triplicity started to really work on me. And then you think about the triplicities, why is that hard to say? Triplicities
It is.
woven like throughout Hecate's history, like all of these, and even like the Triformis ritual we just did, like her dominion over land, sea, and sky, this, modern sort of maiden mother crone thing. And then you know, the 3 worlds, 3 selves, and this idea of the crossroads, Hecate embodied in liminal spaces. And you look behind me, like this sprout is a good example. You see like point A, point B, and then point C is a crossroads. And like
Yeah.
what happens at the crossroads? There's something about being in that central point, that central space that is like evolving and changing, but like part of the 3. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like the source of transformation. And does that make sense? Am I making sense? Like it's very sort of like numinous and hard to explain, but there's something just like really, really magical about the 3 points.
Right. And I want to mention something else. Like if you look at the strophalos behind me, I have a pentacle wreath over it now, so it's not quite as clear, but look at the strophalos, and that is the 3 that becomes the 1.
Yeah.
Like, so whether it's the triangle or the strophalos or, an icon of Hecate that's 3 formed, like there is just such an allure to Hecate Triformis, like she of 3 forms. And I think so we're going to be focusing on what I guess we consider her 3 primary roles, which is keys, crossroads, and witchcraft. But you pointed to something really important that I think if someone is just new to Hecate, that, has kind of heard the more popular way of understanding her today, that they might not be familiar with, which is you referenced Hesiod's Theogony, which
Yeah.
dates back at least like over 2,500 years, we'll say. And in Hesiod's Theogony, this is basically a story about how the older gods, who were called the Titans, were usurped by the younger gods, the Olympians. So most of the Olympians we're probably familiar with, like Zeus and Hera and that whole gang. The Titans were older gods. And so this is a story. Well, it's a creation story in a sense, but it also kind of explains the nature of the universe and what the different gods and goddesses do and who's in charge of what. And Hesiod was a poet, a writer, and so on. And so this is his like narrative poem that he wrote depicting this story. And in it, he describes Hecate very interestingly as having sided with the Olympians in the great battle. And because of this, Zeus defers to her. It's not exact, like she's not in charge of Zeus, but Zeus defers to her. and that she was given precedence over land, sea, and sky. So we get a very early record of Hecate referencing to the three worlds. And so she wasn't in this early kind of origin story of Hecate, she wasn't associated at all with witchcraft. But she was associated with thresholds and crossroads and so on. And not so much with keys, except kind of in the more symbolic sense that because she had precedence over these realms and she helped people in the cities and she did all these good things, that she would be kind of like she would have keys to unlock things because of her powers. So the earliest Hecate is very much this Hecate, who was kind of like this all great mother figure, but very different than the Olympians, not Greek. So the oldest story we have from a Greek talking about Hecate, he is saying she's older, like she's a Titan, but we're adapting her into the Olympians and the world of the Greek Empire, in Athens and so on. So I think that's always fascinated me because for me, what I knew about Hecate way back in the day was that she was the goddess of witches. That was kind of what was popular in the 90s and early 2000s. Like, she was associated with witches. But then for me personally, it's always been more of this, yes, she has a special role with witches and witchcraft, especially the practice of pharmakeia or botanical magic. But she always felt like so much more to me. So I think if you're brand new to Hecate, however you understand her, know that there is like a wealth of history from Hesiod to Proclus at the start of the Common Era. So we're covered about 1,000 years of ancient history, that Hecate was understood in a myriad of ways, and that her association with witchcraft in particular comes from two different types of sources. One would be the collection of fragments, or actually, I should say three. We're doing Hecate Triformis, so I'll say three. One would be the collection of fragments known as the Greek magical papyri in English. And this contains a lot of spells, rituals, charms, and so on. It's sort of like a grimoire or a book of shadows. And Hecate is evoked in many of these workings in this book. Another one is the archaeological evidence of curse tablets, where Hecate is evoked. And these curse tablets, I love these curse tablets because it's just we can talk more about the curse tablets in a bit if you want, but I'll go on. And number three would be kind of like the works of fiction, like Euripides' Medea, works by Ovid. He was a Roman. So there's three sources really describing her as being associated with witches. So we've got three things we want to talk about. Hecate is the key bearer, which we haven't really mentioned yet. And that's found, I would say, more in a religious or spiritual sense when writers were discussing, they were like paying homage to her, for example, like, in a hymn or something that they would call her Cleidochus. But then there's also the Chaldean oracles, which come much later, hundreds of years after Hesiod. And they talk about her as this kind of cosmic key bearer who unlocks the greater mysteries and is this kind of gatekeeper between like mortal existence and what is greater than us in a spiritual sense.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I don't know, there's so much to talk about. I know I said we were going to keep it focused on keys, crossroads, and witchcraft today. So we'll talk about keys.
Okay. I have a thought about the keys. And okay. So Triformis, when you think about Triformis, for me, in a way is sort of like this concept that we are multifaceted, but it's also like seeing things from all different angles, right? And so I think that that in itself, like holding these different perspectives, kind of opens a door that unlocks something deeper, like within ourselves, or a deeper understanding. And that in itself is a key. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. So we've got this lineage, early written history about Hecate from Hesiod, and we need to keep in mind, this is something like when we're looking at these ancient texts, at the time that Hesiod was writing was new. Like writing had just kind of come to the Greeks. So a lot, like if we, the Homeric hymns and so on, these things were being written down like for the first time that we know of. So it was the new technology of the day.
Yeah.
So they were writing down things that they felt were really important. And then, as I would say, as like the Greeks and the Romans and that whole area, as they become much more familiar with writing, they do really amazing and things with it that we still study and are touched by today. So keys come in later, but also they show up in different hymns in different ways over the centuries in association with Hecate. But really this pinnacle is when we are getting into what we would call the common era now. They used to use like, what did they used to use? BC and AD? That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're getting into that common era when the Greek Empire is fallen, Rome is on the rise, Hecate is still very much around as a goddess who is worshipped in temples and so on. And then the Chaldean oracles, which are thought to be like a channeled text that explains the nature of the universe and is very much focused on Hecate and this role as like cosmic key keeper, world soul. There's also the ancient temple at Lagina, which is something you and I talk about frequently, where at this temple she was Hecate Cleidochus. Like Cleidochus means keeper of the keys, and at this temple, that's how she was worshipped in this capacity. And there was even this really beautiful ritual. You want to talk about that ritual that with the young girl?
Sure. So there was a young, I guess we call her a priestess of Hecate, right? Or
Yeah.
yeah, known as a key bearer. And there was a procession, like a festival, and this big procession, and they would walk to a neighboring city called Stratonicaea. And I think it was like an 8 mile walk or something like that, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. And this, like I said, girl, but I think 12 to 14-ish was the
Yeah, I
age.
think they were, yeah, they were very young. They were very young. Um, yeah.
And
And
she
so
would
they,
lead, she would lead the procession.
yes, yes. And there was something there, I think, to do with the key, like the temple key and like the key to the storage of like grain, and like they would distribute, grain to the community and things like that.
Right.
Olive oil and grain.
The key unlocked the riches of the town of
Yeah.
Stratonicaea. It's interesting, of course, Lagina, the temple at Lagina is being excavated. It kind of comes and goes, but the last I heard, they were working on it again.
Mhm.
So this is a very kind of special version of Hecate that maybe was not shared by who we would typically think of as Greeks and Romans, because Lagina was in Caria then, but it's modern day Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
So Hecate was understood in different and experienced in different ways. But the keys, I think you hit the nail on the head, or you really put the key in the lock, in saying that it was about unlocking like something greater, something of value, whether it's the nature of the universe, but or where the grain was stored in the town. Like
Mm-hmm.
she keeps the keys because when she hands them over, like it opens us up to what is meaningful and rich and valuable.
Right. Something we didn't bring up, and I think about, I'm thinking about those, what were the three form statues that would sit outside of households and thresholds in ancient Rome? They were called Hecateon. Is that?
Hecateons, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that there's something there about Hecate as a guardian of thresholds and like keeping these keys, right? As a
Right.
means of protection.
And so these three formed or triformis Hecate statues were placed all over the place. This was widespread. So it was in Greece, was in Rome, it was in like kind of the territories they would have conquered, like Egypt and the middle parts of the Middle East, Turkey, the islands of the Mediterranean, that these three form statues like were at the entrance to homes, around the town. There was there like in Strabo's history, I think it's Strabo's history, that he talks about the giant, like there was a big three formed Hecate that guarded Athens.
Mhm.
So this three formed Hecate, like you said, it's linked to thresholds, like gates, keys, and also to the three-way crossroads. So we should probably talk about like her connection with crossroads. So Hecate sits at this threshold to protect like what is external, from whoever is inside of kind of like her boundaries. And she also extends outwards, kind of like she sits, like you sit her here at the threshold, and then the road stretches out. And if you're the one on the good side of Hecate, like she helps you out along the road too,
Mhm.
and helps you get back home. I think that's like a lighthouse almost,
Yeah, it is like a lighthouse or a torchbearer.
or a torchbearer. So it makes sense why she would be holding torches in this scenario,
Mhm.
because that was how they would see to travel at night.
Mhm.
And then it's okay. So the crossroads is special because of this is a huge part of who Hecate is. Keys, crossroads. We've come this far. But then we need to add in the practice of bringing these meals to Hecate at the three-way crossroads
Mhm.
on the night that the moon was dark, which we call the new moon now.
Right.
They didn't call it the new moon then. But so the three-way crossroads had special importance because of how roads were designed. So like writing was fairly new, complicated road systems were fairly new. Like they didn't have computers, and they didn't have superhighways like we have today, or airplanes. So
Mhm.
their association with these things was really different than ours. And a three-way like where three roads met, these were like narrow roads. They weren't super safe. There weren't stoplights. And like if you were going down one of these roads and others were coming towards the crossroads, like it could be a really dangerous place, and you would really want protection
Yeah.
where these roads would come together. The Romans were much better at roads than the Greeks. The Greeks were fantastic for, like they really took roads to a whole new level, but roads were still really difficult.
Mhm.
And the crossroads was especially difficult because it had the potential that you could, you could have a head-on collision, or people would hide and steal things from you. And most people
Yeah.
walked. I think that's a good point that we need to make, because you said about the procession that they walked. Like, they did, so horses had long been domesticated, but most people didn't have horses. This isn't like, the colonization of North America where most people have horses. Most people were walking on foot wherever they went.
Mhm.
So like an 8-mile walk, that would take like 4 hours.
Yeah. It would take a long time.
So if you were traveling, like walking 8 miles, then like the journey was very different than, I don't know, Kristen, you're gonna hop on a plane and come east and see me, and you know what I mean? Like, it's very different.
Yeah. A little more treacherous.
Very treacherous. You would want some more protection
Or guidance. Yeah.
or guidance, you know what I mean? Like, Hecate could be very important. And not surprisingly, there was a lot of like lore and superstition about the spirits of the crossroads. And because they were just risky in general, this was where troubling spirits were, particularly like, well, many different types of spirits, but the spirits of girls who died before they had been wed,
Mhm.
because they were thought, this is so interesting. Girls who died before they were wed were thought by some people in this area of the ancient Mediterranean, they were thought that because they were unfulfilled, that they hadn't been wives and mothers and had sex ostensibly, that they would be they almost became demons, and that they would try to cause trouble.
Right. It's like they died a dishonorable death. Right. And
Right.
there was something there about like they didn't get a proper burial, and like they were kind of seen as, I don't know what word am I looking for? Outcast.
They were
And
outcasts.
yeah.
So like poor people who
Troublesome.
didn't get proper burials, women who weren't married but died in childbirth, anybody like that who was kind of outside of what was acceptable in this kind of like way of being in the world,
Mhm.
especially for women,
Mhm.
that they would end up at the crossroads. And I think this is where Hecate gets associated with kind of like the spirits of these restless dead, which really, it's interesting because if you were like a woman who died in childbirth, it was viewed that you might come back as a kind of demon spirit and killed other children.
Yeah.
Or like if you were a girl who died outside of the norms, that you would, that you'd be out to cause trouble. I mean, that's really interesting. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because I think it's important later on for how does Hecate get involved with witchcraft?
Right. Especially in regards to protection. I'm thinking about too, I kind of like want to weave some more thoughts into this. I'm thinking about these crossroads as like they're hubs, really, when you think about it. Any crossroads is a meeting place, and people, it was common to leave offerings at the
Mhm.
crossroads. And I'm thinking about like something I try not to do personally when I leave an offering at a crossroads is not put it in the middle of the road, because it's going to draw wildlife. Or
Right.
you think about then it may draw like hungry vagrants, or yeah. And so yeah, there's something there too about Hecate's liminality between like the living and the dead, and the sort of these, I don't know, is vagrant the right word, like the sort of downtrodden,
Right.
yeah, that
And
would seek these.
Right, that they would be around these crossroads too, like
Yeah.
the living downtrodden. So we have like the dead downtrodden
Yeah.
and the living downtrodden. And I think is it Diogenes who, like in his one of his comedies, says something about, giving the poor Hecates, like fine meals are left for Hecate at the crossroads so the poor can eat them.
Yeah, it was something along the lines of as soon as you put it down, they'll snatch it up.
So the crossroads is like a meeting place, very liminal. It's not any of the other three roads that led to it, but it's also thought to be, like you said, like it's a hub,
Mhm.
like a hub of the marginalized, we would call them, like people who had been cast out of society, both alive and dead.
Mhm.
So there's
I think, sorry, I want to add this too. I think about also like, you know, when you stand at a crossroads and you look out in any direction, like there is potential. Like it's part of that. There being potential for like anything to happen, or like, standing in this sort of like liminal space of your own, and like making a choice to like walk this way or like do this. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that plays into Hecate's triplicity and liminality too, and like seeing things from all directions and being sort of like diligent and aware. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like so there's like three-headed Hecate at the three-headed crossroads. She can see in all directions. She protects in all directions. But she doesn't miss anything either.
Yeah.
Like it's so compelling to me, this notion of the crossroads and choice. Like there's always a choice. And personally, I find, like with Hecate, even if I feel that she's like offering me a key, kind of metaphorically, like saying, well, you can do this thing, Cyndi. There's this message I have for you. I'm opening this up for you, but it's your choice. It's like you said about the crossroads. It's like it's always there's a choice. You can go back to where you came from,
Yeah.
or there's at least two other ways to go. So which road do you pick, right? And Hecate in her three form self, she's kind of standing there saying, like, well, that is yours to choose.
And that's the key.
Yeah, that's the key. What way you go forward. Okay, so we've kind of, we're like what's the word here? We're like following through her history. So we've come to kind of this when Athens was a great empire. So we've traveled, a few hundred years from the days of Hesiod, not quite to the point when I was mentioning earlier the Chaldean oracles and the temple at Lagina, but these popular Hekates suppers. And so they were apotropaic, which means they were protective. That people would make these elaborate suppers and take them to Hecate of the three ways. Trivia is a Roman word for it, and deposit them at the. But like most likely, people just ate them, which would make sense. Like if you're traveling, you're walking on foot, you get to the crossroads. I mean, I just imagine like after these rituals, there would be like, say, several of these suppers sitting there, and like travelers the next day would be like, that's perfect. I'm hungry.
Yeah.
But would they be like, oh, I think that's for Hecate. Should I eat it? Like, how hungry am I? Do I want to incur her wrath?
Right. I think it depends on how hungry you are.
Right? Is it worth the risk? So throughout this period of time, the great kind of playwrights and storytellers of ancient Greece and then ancient Rome were writing these great classical works that we still have today. And this is where these fantastic stories of Hecate being involved in as a goddess of witches comes up, and they're amazing. I'm actually gonna read a passage. I'm gonna put it up and read it. Just give me a second. Or do you want to read it? I'll get started and then maybe you can take over.
Okay. Oh, is this the Medea prayer to
No,
Hecate?
I've pulled it, yeah, the Medea from Ovid's Metamorphoses, not Euripides' Medea. And thrice she pours branch water on her hair, and thrice she cries out wailing in the night, and then kneels down upon the earth to pray. Do you want to read the prayer?
Yeah.
Okay.
O night, she cries, most faithful guardian of secrecies, and you, O golden stars, who with the moon relieve the blazing sun, and you as well, three-headed Hekate, who are aware of our undertakings and who assist the mage's spells and arts. And you too, earth, provider of potent herbs, you, breezes, winds, mountains, rivers, lakes, you gods of every grove and every god of night, be present now.
Talk about a spell. So you can see in this passage from Ovid's Metamorphoses, like Medea is not just appealing to Hecate to help her spell, but she's also doing things in threes.
Yeah.
And so the number 3 like is associated with many sacred things and magic in different ways, of course, throughout the centuries. But in that passage, it's so evocative. It's like, yes, here comes Hecate, to help me with my working, to help me with my spell. And there are these incantations that I do, and I do things in threes, and that helps me to summon forth Hecate, and to conjure my spell into life.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these kind of references from these great works of literature that reference Hecate's three-formed self as being like when Medea calls her, when Circe calls her, it's like, this is the three-formed Hecate coming. So there's something about being three-formed that is also, it's like, I would say it's intimidating to many in the, like, even today, but in the ancient world, because it made her different than most of the gods and goddesses that they would be familiar with. Although like there are like the Fates, the Moirai, the Graces, the Muses, like there are other triplicities, but but they are 3 people in one triad. But Hecate is one goddess who is a triad.
Right.
Which made her unique. But there's also something very magical about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, it makes sense. Like, so she has to have those 3 heads to look over the crossroads to protect the home. She has to have the keys because, she's the threshold guardian. And then the 3 forms, because it's unlike any other deity, it for the most part, like a major deity to them, that it's like, oh, so that is magical, because humans only have one body, and most gods and goddesses only have one head and one body, but not Hecate. She has 3. So I think maybe that's part of where this bit with her with the magic comes from, and the witchcraft in the ancient world, because she was physically very different, and that different form meant like she had powers of transformation, like sorcery, you know what I mean? Like, there's something about her being triple formed that meant that she was like a shapeshifter. She was not regular. She was more liminal. Like, it was reinforcing her as an outsider. She wasn't part of the main Greek pantheon, but she was super important because she had these special roles.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about what it means to transcend all forms. And in terms of witchcraft, something about like the union of one thing and the other thing creates a new thing, right? And like that's the source of the magic. Do you know what I'm getting?
Right.
Yeah.
So you take two things to get to one thing here and one thing here, and you put them together and it yields the third.
Yeah.
And the third is the third is greater than the sum of the two that were put into it.
Yes, exactly.
I think you're right. That's so true. And in the Greek magical papyri, she's like summoned many times, like they'll call her different forms of the triple goddess. And then, of course, there all of her companions. Like, so she tends to have triplicities, like in Entering Hecate's Cave, I wrote about her and Persephone and Demeter. In Entering Hecate's Garden, I wrote about her, Medea, and Circe. And we're going to be having a conversation about Circe really soon that y'all will be able to listen to. And Circe and Medea, of course, those great witches of lore, not religious figures. They were figures of myth, but there were not temples dedicated to Medea and Circe the way there were, say, to one of her other common triplicities, which is Artemis, and in particular, because Artemis was very, very popular in parts of the ancient world. So Artemis and Hecate are often interlinked, and sometimes also with the moon goddess Selene, the personification of the moon. So that would be another triplicity. And I threw out, I think, the Fates or the Morai, they're also called, the Graces, the Muses, maybe the Furies. Were there 3 Furies?
I think so. I think so.
So there were a lot of magical female threesomes in Greek and Roman mythology. So the number 3 had all of this kind of magical, kind of scary, but like the muses, well, the muses would come and give us inspiration and creativity, and the fates governed life. So that, all of these kind of mystical, magical aspects of the number 3, like it makes sense that Hecate would be seen as Triformis. It is sure to be one of the most compelling ways of approaching Hecate, to see her as her threefold self. We've been recently kind of revisiting a statue that neither one of us have seen in person, which is the Hecate in the Chiaramonte Museum in the Vatican in Rome, which is a Roman Hecate statue that features her in her 3 forms, and one of the forms is wearing a crown. She's very lovely. So there's many, many statues from antiquity to that depict her as 3-formed. Not always. Like, she wasn't always 3-formed. I think that's an important point to make too. That, like at Lagina, I don't think there's any reference there to her being 3-formed. Do you remember? No.
No, I don't believe so.
In the Chaldean oracles, there's no reference to her being 3-formed. But specifically with this business of Crossroads, she was almost always 3-formed when it came to those places. And then when some of these writers would call upon, the characters in some of these plays and so on would call upon her, it wasn't always 3-formed Hecate, but there was these references to great 3-formed Hecate, and that there's a certain kind of like power and danger in this 3-formed goddess that would come and help with spells, or cause trouble for, I was thinking of, was it in Lucian when he gets into trouble with Hecate because he's irritated her? I forget the details exactly in this. I think it's a comedy, in this comedy, but he gets in trouble with Hecate. Let's say things don't go in his favor. But
I was gonna say, sorry, I
Go
didn't mean to
ahead.
interrupt you. I was just gonna bring up, like even in the Greek magical papyri, or sometimes there are spells where you hear of Hecate being depicted as having like three animal heads.
Oh yeah, we haven't even touched on that. And that's very magical too.
Mhm.
So it would be like a bull, maybe a boar, a dog,
A horse?
a horse,
Is there a horse? A lion? I
a,
think it
a
talks about.
lion, a wolf. And then it's interesting because like we need to talk kind of like, I mean, we could hang out in ancient history for days, but if we kind of bring it forward like into the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, then there's these illustrations that exist of Hecate. I'm going to put that up so you can see it, Kristen.
Okay. There is one I was thinking about where she's depicted with the three animal heads. And I think when I see it, I think, this great, powerful Hecate, but I think it was
There
meant
we go.
that one to portray her as like monstrous.
So this is from, I believe, the 15th century. So this is this is an Italian illustrator. So these were Christians,
Yeah.
Roman Catholics to be specific, and they were not trying to depict the ancient gods and goddesses in a favorable light. They were kind of trying to show, like, look at those savage pagans that came before us. We're all evolved Roman Catholics here, worshiping the true God, so like you said, so here's Hecate with her three animal heads. And here's Diana or Artemis leading the hunt. It's a very organized hunt. Women up to no good, a bunch of women up to no good. That's what this is depicting. What is that quote? Well-behaved women never make history. I think that should be the caption for this illustration. So Artemis is on her way to Diana is on her way to do Diana things, and Hecate is like being liminal off to one side, but definitely involved, and she's walking in the same direction as everybody. And she's got these three animal heads. So, Hecate, like to us, it's like, well, she has animal heads because she's about magic and connection to the natural world. She's, physis, the natural, and so on. But I think in this depiction, it was to kind of show that she was like savage.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that image for so long. There is a whole like digital collection of photographs taken from that book, and it's really enchanting because that book goes through like a lot of like the ancient Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. And it's interesting to see. Oh, I wanted to talk about something else too. So we've talked about the Graces, the Muses, the Moirai. We need to talk about Shakespeare and his weird sisters.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if you're watching, I've put up, there's a lot of art on the weird sisters. So I just grabbed one piece. I really like this one. It's not what you would call a favorable, like they're not like there's other paintings that show them as kind of beautiful, but this one, I don't know. I really like the skull bat thing flying in the background, Kristen, to be honest. Like this is my favorite thing about this painting is this thing that you can hardly see. So the weird sisters in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So there is Hecate herself, kind of the queen of witches depicted in Macbeth, but then there are these weird sisters. And I recently watched, there's a new-ish story of Macbeth that's on Apple Plus. That's from, did you watch it?
The tragedy of Macbeth, I think, is
Yeah,
that the one?
yeah. And
Yeah.
how the weird sisters are depicted in that. Listen, if you all just type in the tragedy of Macbeth, weird sisters into the YouTube and watch because there's shorts of from the scenes of this on YouTube that you can watch. And the first of all, the actor who portrays like the weird sisters are played by one woman. It's just it is magic, and it's you talk.
No, her name is Catherine Hunter. Her name is Catherine Hunter, and you can find a clip if you look it up, and it is very, very powerful.
It's very powerful. It's enchanting. It's unsettling. I think
Yeah.
they really connected to, how the ancients might have seen Hecate. Like that. I don't think the weird sisters and Hecate were necessarily completely separate, even in Macbeth, even in Shakespeare's mind, right? Like that.
And I love that it shows like these triplicities contained within one being.
So you have an assignment, which is go to YouTube and look up The Tragedy of Macbeth and watch some of the excerpts of the scenes with the weird sisters. You'll be moved by it. It's hard to describe. You'll be moved. How else do we connect with Hecate Triformis? I guess we do so many things, right? We do rituals that have the three in them, the meditation. There's so many ways. The three selves, our own kind of like root, heart, and crown. There's and our own nature, like that we are multifaceted and fluid and changing and transforming and going through so many different things. And there's something magical about seeing ourselves in that kind of fluidity.
Yeah. And we didn't say the phrase, but like I think there's something there too about being in this continual cycle of life, death, rebirth. I mean, even in, like if you want to zero in on like even in meditation, the in breath and the out breath is like, this sort of cyclical trinity, right?
Yeah.
Of life and death and rebirth.
Yeah, it's like in, pause, out, in, pause, out. Like this triplicity. I mean, we didn't even get into her like how Hecate is three formed links to the life cycle a lot, but then there's also her connection with childbirth, protection of children, and her association, like we talked about spirits. So there's this triplicity that she's associated with life, death, and like birth, death, and and life itself.
Yeah.
But like the totality of that, which is very liminal, when you try to put all these three things together, it becomes all things and nothing. And I think that's, what Triformis is. She is three formed and at the same time so much more. One of my big early, like, aha, I actually understand something moments was like years and years ago, back in the days of paganspace.net. And I was talking to someone about Hecate, and they said, we were talking about her triple form nature, and they said it's like the three phases of the moon, and then the dark moon or the new moon is hidden, and I was like, oh, that's it.
Yeah.
So Hecate is three formed, waxing, waning, full, and then what you can't see, the mystery, and that's the magic of Hecate, is the fourth, the dark moon, the darkness. And that's where like that's what can't be explained, that can't be put in a statue or a play or, and that's when you connect to her three forms, it unlocks that fourth, the mystery. So thanks so much for hanging out with us as we wandered through Hecate's three forms. I hope, however you connect to your own triplicities and Hecate's three forms, that you see this as unlocking something greater in yourself and that power of transformation and the reality of magic and change. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Keeping Her Keys abides at the crossroads between modern life and the deeper world of goddesses, natural magic, and witchcraft that leads to healing and personal empowerment. You can learn more about my teaching and writing and find loads of resources at keepingherkeys.com. The Keeping Her Keys podcast is produced and hosted by me, Cyndi Brannen. You can learn more about me at the website, too. My frequent co host and co producer is the fabulous Kristen Bennett, and the original music is provided by my son, Aidan O'Brien. Thanks for listening. Hail Hekate.